They thought the war was over. But in April 1945, British soldiers opened a gate and found a nightmare the world had never seen. Bergen Belsen, a name that became synonymous with death, and a trial that forced humanity to face its darkest truth. I was only following orders would never be enough. April 15, 1945. British soldiers marched through the rusted gates of Bergen Belsen, expecting to secure just another German camp. What they found instead was a world where war had ended, but hell itself had taken root. Before their eyes stretched 60,000 prisoners, gaunt, skeletal, barely alive. Scattered among them, 10,000 corpses lay unburied, abandoned to decay beneath the spring sun. There were no gunshots, no shouted orders, only silence, and the suffocating stench of death that clung to every inch of the camp. These were men, women, and children reduced to shadows of humanity. Some crawled on the ground, too weak to lift their heads. Others stared blankly, eyes hollowed by starvation and despair. In the wooden barracks, bodies pressed together on rotten planks, skin mottled with sores, breath rattling like the final notes of a requiem. Even battle-hardened soldiers, men who had survived the Blitz, who had faced tanks and artillery, stood frozen, their weapons hanging useless at their sides. Nothing in war had prepared them for this. The camp was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard built in slow motion. Disease, famine, and cruelty had done what bullets could not. In the days that followed, the world would learn its first intimate lesson of the Holocaust, recorded not in whispers or rumors, but in images and testimony no one could ever deny. And from that moment, a hunt began. A hunt for the men and women who had ruled Bergen Belsen with iron whips and empty hearts. Their reckoning would not come from the chaos of battle, but from the solemn voice of justice. The question was no longer who had survived. The question was, who would answer for it? Bergen Belsen did not begin as a camp of horror. In 1940, it was built to hold French and Belgian prisoners of war. Later, Soviet soldiers filled its barracks. But in 1943, everything changed. The camp was handed over to the SS, and under their command, Bergen Belsen transformed into something far darker. It was no longer a place of confinement. It became a place of deliberate neglect, where slow death was as certain as a bullet. By April 1945, order had collapsed. Guard towers still loomed, but the SS no longer truly controlled what lay within. Disease swept unchecked through the barracks. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, each one a silent executioner. More than 500 people died every single day. The camp's hospital was nothing more than a wooden hut. There was no medicine, no bandages, only bodies pressed together on a filthy floor. Even the strongest prisoners wasted away, their skin stretched taut over bone, their voices reduced to whispers. British troops had been warned there were sick inmates inside, but no one could have imagined the reality. 60,000 souls remained, most barely alive, their clothing rotted to rags, their eyes sunk deep into hollow sockets. Some had not eaten for days. Others no longer had the strength to speak. Children whimpered faintly or simply stared, too numb to cry. Mothers clutched tin cups or broken shoes, the last fragments of a life before the camp swallowed them whole. Everywhere lay the dead, piled in ditches, slumped in bunks, curled on the ground where they had fallen, sometimes still clutching the hand of the living beside them. No graves marked their passing. No prayers were spoken. Vermin scurried between the huts, over bodies that had long ceased to move. The stench of rot and human waste hung thick in the air, searing the throats of every soldier who stepped inside. It was not the sound of battle that filled Bergen Belsen. It was silence. A silence so heavy that even men hardened by years of war could barely breathe. This was the reality that confronted the British Army. They had come expecting surrender. Instead, they walked into a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Bergen Belsen was not simply another captured camp. It was the embodiment of cruelty, a factory of despair where tens of thousands had perished unseen, and tens of thousands more stood at the edge of the same abyss. To the world, it was proof that evil did not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it thrived in neglect, in disease, and in hunger. And once the gates were opened, there was no turning away. On April 16, 1945, just one day after entering Bergen Belsen, the British Army established headquarters at the very gates of the camp. Their mission was twofold: contain the raging epidemic that threatened to spread beyond the barbed wire, and bring relief to those still clinging to life. The task was monumental. The camp was a breeding ground for typhus and dysentery. Every corner reeked of decay. Every hour brought new deaths. And yet, among the ruins, thousands still waited for a chance at survival. Military doctors and nurses were rushed in from nearby field hospitals. Hardened by years on the front, even they faltered at the sight. They erected makeshift wards under canvas sheets, carried the weakest to stretchers, and dressed in full protective suits to guard against infection. Some lasted only hours before collapsing themselves, quarantined for fear of carrying the sickness out with them. For every life saved, others slipped away, their bodies carried to mass graves dug just beyond the camp. Relief was not only medical. The British distributed bread, water, and soup. Yet starvation had ravaged the prisoners so completely that even food became a danger. Stomachs shriveled by months of deprivation could not handle sudden nourishment. Soldiers watched helplessly as some survivors, desperate for a taste of life again, succumbed after their first real meal. The camp had turned hunger itself into a weapon, one that lingered even after liberation. At the same time, another operation began. Orders went out to hunt down every member of the SS who had served at Bergen Belsen. Guards tried to vanish among the prisoners, some even donning striped uniforms to blend in. Others fled into nearby woods. But the British combed every hut, checked every document, and questioned survivors who remembered faces all too well. Within 4 days, more than 80 SS men and women were in custody. Among them were names that would be forever stained with infamy. Joseph Kramer, commandant of Belsen, stood out. Calm, unshaken, the man prisoners had called the Beast of Belsen. He guided British officers through the camp, showing piles of corpses as if they were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared. At his side was Irma Grese, only 21 years old, yet already notorious for her cruelty at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, before Belsen. Known as the hyena of Auschwitz, she was remembered by survivors for her whip, her dog, and her chilling lack of remorse. These arrests signaled the next chapter. Bergen Belsen was no longer just a site of horror. It was now the scene of an investigation, a hunt for accountability. For the prisoners who had survived, the nightmare was not over. But at last, the seeds of justice had been sown, and soon, the world would watch as the men and women who ruled this kingdom of death were forced to face their reckoning. In the months that followed the liberation, the British Army turned Bergen Belsen into a crime scene. From May to August 1945, military police and war crimes investigators worked without rest. Every corner of the camp was searched. Every scrap of paper, every record, every testimony was gathered. Survivors were interviewed one by one. Their words became threads in a tapestry of evidence, linking names, faces, and actions to the suffering that had unfolded behind those barbed wires. The investigators uncovered rosters of prisoners, lists of transfers, documents assigning guards to duties, even ration logs that revealed the deliberate starvation of thousands. They matched witness statements to official orders. Survivors identified guards by scars, by voices, by the way a whip was held. No detail was too small. Each became a brick in the case being built. And with every brick, the walls of denial grew weaker. By August, the work was complete. 45 defendants were chosen, 25 men and 20 women. They were not only commandants or senior officers, they included guards, block leaders, medical staff, even cooks. The message was clear. At Bergen Belsen, guilt was not confined to those who gave the orders. Anyone who had played a part in the machinery of cruelty would stand trial. No role was too minor, no uniform too lowly. Responsibility stretched to every hand that had struck a prisoner, every mouth that had shouted an order, every eye that had turned away. Among the accused were figures already notorious. Joseph Kramer, the camp commandant, calm and unrepentant. Irma Grese, barely past 20, remembered for her savage beatings and icy smile. Alongside them stood guards who had overseen the roll calls, women who had managed the female blocks, men who had dragged prisoners to punishment cells. In the dock, they would all sit side by side, equal in the eyes of justice. The decision to bring them to trial was historic. It marked the first time British authorities organized a major war crimes tribunal of their own. While the world's eyes turned toward the upcoming Nuremberg proceedings, the trial at Lüneburg would become the first stage where survivors could speak, and where the argument of only following orders would be tested under the weight of truth. Bergen Belsen was no longer just the graveyard of tens of thousands. It had become a symbol, a place where silence had been broken. And now its shadows would spill into the courtroom, where the guilty would no longer hide behind walls of barbed wire, but sit under the unforgiving gaze of history. September 17, 1945. In the town of Lüneburg, northwest Germany, the first great British war crimes trial of the post-war world began. The courtroom was crowded. At the front sat the judges, the prosecutors, and the defense counsel. Behind them, journalists from across Europe and America, their pens ready to record history. And along the length of the dock, 45 defendants, men and women who had turned Bergen Belsen into a place of shadows. Some wore plain clothes. Others still clung to scraps of uniform. A few stared at the floor, lips trembling. But many sat upright, their expressions blank, as if daring the world to judge them. At the center was Joseph Kramer, commandant of Belsen, his face unreadable. At his side, Irma Grese, young, composed, her reputation already notorious. Together they embodied the cold face of cruelty. The prosecutors wasted no time. They laid out the charges: murder, torture, starvation, acts against humanity. They presented photographs taken the day the camp was liberated, images of skeletal prisoners, of heaps of corpses rotting in the sun. They brought in film reels that showed British soldiers walking through the camp, gagging on the stench. The evidence was undeniable, burned into celluloid for all to see. But the most devastating testimony came not from paper or film. It came from the survivors. Men and women who had endured the endless roll calls, the beatings, the selections. Their voices filled the chamber, trembling yet resolute. They described guards kicking prisoners until bones broke, whips slashing across backs, starvation rations that reduced the living to skeletons, mothers clutching children, forced to watch them waste away. Some witnesses wept as they spoke. Others paused, their silence more powerful than words. and every sentence cut like a blade across the courtroom's silence. The defendants responded in different ways. Some denied everything. Some claimed ignorance. Most clung to one phrase: "I was only following orders." It was a plea repeated again and again, as if obedience could wash away cruelty. But the court pressed harder. Was it obedience that made a guard raise a whip? Was it obedience that made a young woman laugh as prisoners were beaten? Each question stripped the excuses bare. Day after day, the trial dragged on, witness after witness, exhibit after exhibit. Slowly, the facade of indifference cracked. The world outside listened closely. For the first time, it was not generals or ministers in the dock. It was the hands-on executioners, the ones who carried out the orders, who stood face to face with the condemned. Bergen Belsen was no longer a silent grave. It had become a stage for truth. And in that courtroom, the dead spoke through the living. Justice, long delayed, had finally found its voice. November 17th, 1945. After 2 months of testimony, the verdicts were delivered. Out of 45 defendants, the majority were found guilty. 11 were sentenced to death. 19 received long prison terms. 7 were acquitted for lack of evidence. But the message was clear. No rank, no uniform, no excuse of orders could shield them from responsibility. The court had spoken. Justice would now take its final step. Those condemned to die were transferred to Hamelin Prison in Lower Saxony. There they waited under constant guard, isolated from other inmates, watched closely to prevent suicide. Among them was Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, who had guided British officers past piles of corpses with chilling calm. Beside him was Irma Grese, only 21, remembered by survivors as one of the most merciless figures of the camp. Each name carried the weight of thousands of silent voices. Each awaited the rope. The task of execution fell to Albert Pierre Point, Britain's most experienced hangman. On the morning of December 13, 1945, he arrived at Hamelin. The prison was sealed. No cameras, no crowds, no speeches. Only officials, soldiers, and witnesses allowed by law. One by one, the condemned were led from their cells, their identities confirmed, their steps echoing against the stone corridors. The gallows had been prepared with precision. A black hood was pulled down. A noose tightened around the neck. Pierre Point gave the signal. A trap door opened. In a matter of seconds, the sentence was carried out. No cries, no struggle, only silence, followed by the thud of finality. The room was cleared, reset, and the next prisoner brought in. From dawn until noon, the executions continued, each life ending in the same quiet ritual. When it was over, the bodies were buried in unmarked graves, far from any place of remembrance. No tombstones, no names, no chance for pilgrimage or martyrdom. The condemned vanished into anonymity, erased as they had once tried to erase others. For the British, this was deliberate. The world would remember the victims, not the perpetrators. With the last grave filled, the chapter of Bergen Belsen's trial closed. Records were archived, photographs and testimonies stored away as proof for history. Survivors, though scarred, began the long road of recovery in temporary shelters and hospitals. Bergen Belsen itself was reduced to ashes, its wooden huts burned to the ground to stop disease from spreading further. But the memory of its horror remained, carved into the conscience of all who had seen it. The executions at Hamelin were not an end. They were a beginning, the moment when the world declared that even in war, even in chaos, there would be accountability. Bergen Belsen no longer stands. Its wooden barracks were burned, its watchtowers torn down. but the shadow it cast never disappeared. The trial that followed its liberation became a milestone in the history of justice. For the first time, the world declared that crimes against humanity could not be hidden behind orders or dissolved into the chaos of war. Responsibility was personal, and guilt would follow the guilty to the very end. The principles forged at Lüneburg did not remain confined to Germany. They flowed into the Nuremberg trials that opened days later, shaping the very language of international law. They resurfaced decades later in Rwanda, in the Balkans, in tribunals across the globe. Each time the same lesson was invoked, that obedience is no defense, that silence is complicity, and that atrocities committed against the innocent will always echo back to those who caused them. The images captured at Bergen Belsen became part of humanity's record. Photographs of British soldiers standing stunned among heaps of bodies. Film reels of skeletal survivors staggering toward freedom. Testimonies of prisoners who had endured starvation and cruelty. These were preserved, not for vengeance, but for memory, for schools, for courts, for generations yet unborn. They became the answer to every denial, every attempt to erase what had been done. Proof carved in image, word, and witness. Today, the grounds of Belsen are quiet. No barbed wire, no guards, only rows of stone markers, grassy mounds, and plaques that tell of the suffering that once consumed this place. School groups walk the paths. Survivors, now few in number, return to speak. Their voices tremble with age, but their words carry the same weight they did in 1945. They remind us that history is not distant. It is alive, waiting for us to either heed it or repeat it. The legacy of Bergen Belsen is not only one of horror, it is one of warning. When compassion dies, when obedience is prized above conscience, when humanity turns its face away, then the gates of hell can open anywhere. The trial at Lüneburg was a signal to the world that such darkness can be confronted, that justice, however late, can still rise from the ashes. And in that truth lies its final power. For the victims, for the survivors, and for every generation that comes after, Bergen Belsen endures as a scar and as a promise.